Okay, so this is the final piece of preparation for your examination on Friday. Lovely day to have an exam. Luck of the draw, I suppose. So welcome to this national support session. So firstly, as you all know, this is a take-home exam, which means that you'll be doing it at home or wherever you are at that particular point in time. The exam is weighted 40% of your final year mark. So those assignments that you've done count 25% each, and your ICE tasks count 10%. So this is weighted 40%. And your exam is released at midnight on the 24th, and you've got 21 hours to complete the exam. Okay, so I would suggest you rather go to bed and wake up at a decent time and have a clear mind when you approach this. Don't sit waiting for it to be released at 12 o'clock. So you've got plenty of time to do it. It's 120 marks. So note, it's not 100 marks. Our assignments were out of 100. This is out of 120. It's an open book exam. You'll be used your prescribed textbook. So please all make sure that you have access to your prescribed material. And you'll be needing to use additional resources, which means that you'll need to log on to the library website and use one of their databases at some point for additional resources. And it will be covering all learning units. So the guide it gives you, it says this assessment should take you 2 hours to complete. However, you have 21 hours, midnight to 9 p.m. on the same day. So please submit before 9 p.m. The internet traffic gets very busy closer to 9 p.m. So rather, as soon as you've done it, get it submitted so that you don't have any problems. Okay, so that's how it works. It's released at midnight. You've got 21 hours till 9 o'clock Friday evening to submit your assignment. You'll need your textbook, and you'll need to be able to access the library and additional resources that you might need. So make sure. I use EBSCOhost. Is probably the best place to start. Okay, from your module guide before the exam, so the exam will assess all learning units. We can't tell you what will appear and what won't appear. You can use other textbooks, of course you can. Textbooks are an academic source, but I would suggest that your focus you need to have your actual textbook as well. Other textbooks are fine to support your work. Okay, remember, the questions will focus on your application of the theory to different scenarios. It's really important. Remember, this is the difference between an exam that you write in an exam hall where you have to just recall information. Because this is a take-home exam, like your assignments, there's a very big focus on applying the theory to different scenarios. So that is where they give you a case study, and they give you a case study for a reason. So as much as you know the theory, you need to mention or reference back to the case study to show you can apply it. And that's a very big key to this, is the application of your theory. You'll be expected to respond to short theory-based questions as well. So before the exam, and we'll go through these now, focus on the relevant learning units and that you've got, understand those. Make sure you understand the relevant sections in the prescribed work and can apply it. Again, that process of application is important at this level. Work through all the relevant activities and exercises and revision questions. You can also review past papers. Now, just please be careful with this, because this year is a new textbook. Okay, and it also means that the learning outcomes have changed slightly. So if you've pulled up last year's exam paper, there are going to be questions in there that aren't relevant to you. So don't panic about them. Okay, we're going to work through what's in our learning units. So you just take what's relevant to your learning units, and that's what I've done to show you in this national support session. So that's before the exam. Make sure you're all prepared and ready. During the exam, so once you get that paper, go through it first before you start it. Look at the different words, the task words, describe, apply. Check the mark allocations for each question to show that you're able to provide the correct depth. Often it will give you how many pages that answer should be or what page length not to exceed. Plot down your answers so that you've got a bit of a framework. Don't work on questions you find challenging, because remember, you'll start each question on a new page, so it doesn't really matter if you go back to a question. Do the ones you can do and that you're confident with, and remember to number your questions carefully. So that's during the exam, and that's basic exam technique. You've got plenty of time to go through it, map it out, and then start the exam. So if anyone's got any questions on that, but it's very straightforward. Hi, Kath. Kath is here, but she can just answer questions if she's able to. So what we'll do is we'll just work through the different learning units. Now, with our assignments, I think our assignments have covered quite comprehensively learning units 1, 2, and 3, but let's just revise them. And I think it's really important. Remember, this is what they want you to know. So look at what is written in those learning units and make sure you can, for each of those outcomes, make sure that you understand what is the outcome of that particular section of work. And in the prescribed material column, there are also some specific pointers. So for example, our first learning unit on the history of psychology, there's a specific part of it right at the end on the perspectives. It asks you to provide an overview of the 6 contemporary theoretical perspectives, and it specifically points you to a table in your book 1.9. Okay, I've put a copy of that table there. And so make sure that they're not going to, each different textbook has different ideas of what the perspectives in psychology are and how they're classified. This one very specifically has got its own table. It's table 1.9, and those perspectives are listed in that table. So we've done quite a lot of work on the history of psychology, but just make sure that you look at those outcomes, you look at the prescribed material, and that you're clear on what it is. Okay. So that's on the evolution of psychology. So a question, this is from last year's paper, and again, the perspectives, how they frame those perspectives were different, but the example type of question is the second half of the 20th century, psychologists were examining psychological phenomena from a handful of perspectives, and it names them, which is a little bit different to how they're named in your textbook. And it says 2 of the perspective has been mentioned, discuss any 2 of the remaining. So that's 10 marks. So that's 5 marks each. So that's a nice paragraph each on 2 of those different perspectives. And that's again how a question could be laid out. So that's from last year's paper, but don't look at the wording of the perspectives there because they differ from the way it's been given to you this year in your textbook. Okay, so you focus in on 1.9 if you're asked to look at perspectives. The section on research methods in psychology, now this is a new section this year, which is why there's no examples of this in a past paper. So this is really to ensure that you have an understanding of how research is done in psychology and that it's a scientific approach. And in our first assignment, we did cover a portion of this work. We did the scientific steps, and you were also asked at one point to apply to a case study whether you would use quantitative versus qualitative. So that's sort of been covered. The part that we haven't covered in an assignment so far is looking, and it's not in depth, it's just understanding the difference between descriptive and inferential statistics, descriptive being your mean, your median, and mode. It's used to describe, and your inferential is how you take something from a sample and you can expand it to a population. So just make sure you understand what those are. You don't have to have a deep understanding of formulas, but just know what it means. There might be a question on ethics. Again, ethics are very clearly outlined in your textbook, very straightforward, and as is evaluating research. So some of that's already been covered in the assignments, but there's few learning outcomes that haven't. So when you're revising, just make sure that you have a clear understanding. It's written very nicely and straightforward in your textbook, so just focus in on the research methods. But that's why you won't find any past questions, and I'm a little bit lost as to how to guide you. I think what they asked you in your assignment was very clever around applying those steps to the research article. So again, it's application. And a lot of students struggled with that question, but when you go back and look at it, once you've got your textbook open and understand it, you'll see that it's very straightforward. The session on the biology of behavior, again, this last assignment of ours covered this in extensive detail. So I can't see it being a big section, but again, who knows? The question from last year's paper was very similar to one in your assignment. It was for 20 marks, and it was speaking about the electrical signaling within the neuron. So we've already comprehensively covered the hardware of the nervous tissue, how signals are sent and received. We've done a lot on the peripheral and the central nervous system. Looking inside the brain scanning and brain imaging we've done in our last assignment. So the part that's sort of left there is that there's different parts of the brain. I know my students, one of the ICE tasks was that. And again, it's very theoretical. It comes very much from the textbook. Just make sure you reference it if you're asked a question on that section. So that learning unit, again, has quite comprehensively been covered in the assignments that we've had to date. The fourth one is around sensory systems and perception, and this is where we start getting into areas that we haven't covered in assignments so far. So I think there could be quite a strong possibility that something is going to come up in this aspect. So understanding your learning outcomes, and look very clearly at your learning outcomes. It's given you references to 2 tables there. It's given references to images. So understanding the differences between sensation and perception is very important. Know what the difference is between those things and make sure you understand what those different terms mean. Sensation, perception, transduction, the thresholds, the signal detection theory. And then the sensory systems, it's looking at the eye, the ear, the smell and gustatory and olfactory systems, and be able to distinguish them. That's very straightforward. It's in your textbook. There's diagrams, specific figures that want you to make sure you know. And so that's also quite straightforward. So for me, this is a question from last year's paper. And it's around sensation and perception, and 2 friends are arguing while watching a soccer game as to whether or not there was an illegal tackle that had just taken place. Using the above example, and this is where the application comes in, explain the concepts of sensation and perception. So that's part 1 of it, is to explain what is sensation and what is perception, and then to speak about how they differ between people. But it does ask you to use the example. So you need to refer back that in the situation of the soccer match, one of the people in the case study might not have been paying attention, the other might have been. There's a number of reasons which will follow, but just please, if it says to you, it gives you a case study, it gives you a case study for a reason. Okay, it's theory and application to the case study. So this picture is from your textbook, figure 4.1, which it refers to, and it says to you the distinction between sensation and perception. So sensation involves the stimulation of sensory organs, whereas the perception is the interpretation of that input. At a point they meet where the sensory receptors convert physical energy into neural impulses. So be very clear on understanding and being able to define the concepts of sensation and perception. And that's from last year's question. Reasons why people respond to some stimuli and other people to other stimuli. This is a concept check. The concept checks in your textbook are very good. They really do. They're there for a reason and to help you understand. So the concept check 4.3 says, write down 5 factors that can influence the identification of a stimulus, for example, personal bias. Okay, so the reasons why some people might perceive a stimulus and others might be their motivation, their personal expectations, their exposure, how alert they are, and their personal sensitivity. But also there's other stimuli in the environment that can impact on the detection of signals, as a person could be so entirely focused on one stimulus, they're completely unaware of another within the same. So in a soccer stadium, when the match is going on, there could be crowds shouting, there could be a lot of noise, therefore your visual stimuli of the tackle, it might be weakened by all of the auditory stimuli that are taking place at the same time. So you can start to see how you would take those responses and you would adapt it to the case study of the soccer match. And that's why they give you the case study. So apply what you know to the case study. So that's how they looked at sensation and perception in the previous paper. The nature of consciousness, or this learning unit, states of consciousness, again, this is something that hasn't been touched on yet. So being able to define what is consciousness and explain what includes, and the varying states of consciousness. Those are the first learning outcomes, and go back to those and make sure you understand how to define it and what it includes and the different states of consciousness. Understanding the biological rhythms and sleep. Okay, so that's the biological and circadian rhythms of sleep, and then the sleep cycle. I'm pretty sure you're going to get something out of this section. So understanding states of consciousness from your textbook. What is consciousness? Make sure you know what it is, and it's being aware of internal and external stimuli. You will, Ayanda, should you answer questions according to your textbook is going to be your primary source, but in some cases it will ask you to use additional sources. So where it doesn't ask you necessarily for additional sources, your reference point will be your textbook, and it must be cited as such. So your consciousness involves your awareness of what's external to you, internal to you, of yourself being unique, and your own cognitions or thoughts about your experiences. That is what consciousness is. It's personal awareness. And the states of consciousness are basically, if you think of your daily cycle, think about EEGs that we used in our assignment, measuring brain waves. There's different patterns of brain waves that happen throughout the course of the day. So understand that states of consciousness, and there's a nice table there. We know that they love tables. We've seen that in our assignments, and we'll see it in one of the exam questions, that there will be instances of tables. So wherever you see a table, pay attention to it. So the EEG pattern, for example, when we're awake and processing information and solving problems, is a beta EEG pattern. When we start to get more relaxed, it's alpha waves. When we enter into light sleep, it's theta waves, and deep sleep, it's delta waves. So those are our different states of consciousness during the course of the day. Okay, we move through those different states of consciousness as the day progresses. So from this, understand and define consciousness and what states of consciousness are. There's a nice concept check as well there, and I've put in the answers for you. So it was looking about the relationship between brain activity and variations in consciousness. Check your understanding of this relationship by indicating the kind of EEG activity that would probably be dominant in each of the situations. So that's just helping you understand states of consciousness and the different brain waves and brain patterns that follow. So if you're playing a video game, for example, it's beta waves, because a video game requires alert information processing, which is associated with beta waves. If you're in a deep meditation, that's alpha waves. Our body is relaxed, it's associated with alpha waves, and studies show increased alpha in meditators. If you've just fallen asleep, that point where you're just going off to sleep, it's theta waves. Okay. Delta waves, sleepwalking across the lawn. If you're sleepwalking, that stage in the sleep cycle where sleepwalking occurs is usually in our non-REM sleep. It's in our delta wave activity. And if you're in the middle of a terrible nightmare, beta waves because nightmares are dreams, so you're probably in REM sleep, which paradoxically produces wide awake beta waves. So those concept checks are good to do. And that's just an example of one that will help you understand those different variations in consciousness, which is one of the learning outcomes for this module. This is an example from last year's paper. Now ignore the genotype and phenotype because we don't cover that in this particular in these particular outcomes, but you can see it was a very simple question right at the beginning of the paper, and it's just it's 5 marks. And look at the circadian rhythm. So it's 5 marks. It asks you to explain it, but then for 3 marks to use examples from your own life. They do like you to use examples from your own life, and you might see that occur quite often. So your process would be, what is a circadian rhythm? Okay, it's the 24-hour cycle of physical, mental, and behavioral changes, which are natural processes, and they respond primarily to light or dark and affect most living things. And I put in the citation, and then it's asking you to apply it to your own life. So I wake up at 7 o'clock, regardless of what time I go to bed, even if I'm studying till after midnight. And I also feel hungry as soon as I'm awake and need to eat in order to start my day. That is part of my circadian rhythm in a 24-hour cycle. I wake up at 7, regardless of what time I go to bed. And when I wake up, I'm hungry. A circadian rhythm sits in a 24-hour cycle, and all of our bodies go through our own circadian rhythms, which might be different between us, and we can all apply that to points of our own 24-hour cycle. So that would be a 5-mark question, 2 marks the explanation, and 3 marks to be able to substantiate it. So again, it's a good example of application. This was a question, was it from last year's exam? I can't remember where. It might have been from an assignment, and it was on the sleep cycle. So again, this is an area that hasn't been examined. It wasn't in last year's paper. It was from an assignment. And again, this is the lovely table format. So in table format, describe the stages of sleep one would go through in a typical sleep cycle. Was it last year's assignment? Yeah, thanks, it was, Kath. Addressing the following questions. So when does each stage in the typically occur during the cycle? So your table would be broken into the different stages. So stages 1 through to 5. And you'd have a heading, one column would be when does each stage occur? The next column would be what is the brainwave activity and the autonomic response for each stage. And the third column would be what is the typical reaction of a person when awakened at each stage. So that is a table question that involves the sleep cycle. And so the bottom part of the question says, note, you need to use at least 2 different sources, which you will need to refer to in your in-text referencing and your reference list. The use of the prescribed textbook does not form part of the sources you should use. So that again is a table question with answers where there needs to be in-text citation in the table that then refers us to 2 sources other than your textbook. And they, in that case, they were very kind and gave a link to one kind of source that could be used. So on the right-hand side is just how your sleep cycle works, moving through the different stages, and your table would be set out to map those different stages. So that's a 35-mark question. So if we've got 5 stages, some of the marks would be allocated to the sources, because we do make sure if it says to use 2 sources, then there will be marks allocated for those sources. And the rest of the marks would be divided across the different sleep cycles and different stages. So that is how they asked the question in a previous assignment. And again, a very nice concept check so that you understand it. And again, this is a kind of table that was put up. It's being able to compare the REM sleep and the non-REM sleep. And a table here could have provided you with a systematic comparison of REM and non-REM. That means comparing the difference between the 2, but that would have deprived you of the opportunity to check your understanding. So they ask you to create your own table and fill in the blanks below with a word or phrase highlighting the differences between REM and non-REM sleep. So for example, the first part is what type of EEG activity takes place in REM sleep. That's where we're dreaming, our brain is wide awake, and the brain waves are mostly beta. In non-REM sleep, it's varied and lots of delta waves. So it's comparing the difference between the two. Eye movements in REM sleep, remember REM is rapid eye movement, so our eyes are moving rapidly. In non-REM sleep, our eye movements are slow or absent. In REM sleep, dreaming, compare dreaming, frequent and vivid dreaming in REM, less frequent in non-REM. How difficult is it to awake? The depth of the sleep. Okay, REM sleep, very generally difficult to awaken. Non-REM sleep, very generally easier to awaken. The percentage of total sleep, we spend less time in REM and more time in non-REM. It increases or decreases during childhood. REM sleep decreases in childhood, but non-REM increases. The timing in the sleep, your REM happens later in the cycle and your non-REM earlier. So that's a nice table to help you understand the differences and compare the difference between REM and non-REM sleep. Okay, so I hope that helps you with that section. I'm pretty confident. I hope to see something on sleep. And then the final section of final learning unit is on conditioning and learning. And again, this hasn't been done in an assignment, so I think you really need to make sure you understand these learning outcomes. A definition of what learning is the first one. The second theme is around classical conditioning. Define what it is. So classical conditioning is our Pavlov and our Pavlov's dog, and always have that little picture because it just helps you remember what classical conditioning is and being able to outline Pavlov's demonstration. I think we've had an option to discuss Pavlov in previous assignments. So we have focused on classical conditioning, and I think you've got a good understanding. And the same is with operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is Skinner and the rat box. So being able to define what it is, explain and apply the basic terminology. So make sure you understand for both of them, make sure you're clear on what the terminology is for those. And explain in detail Skinner's principles of positive and negative reinforcement. So it's interesting that it says in detail. So you need to know exactly how Skinner's rat boxes work around positive and negative reinforcements. And the final piece of learning is observational learning. And that is being able to define it, what it is, explain the basic process. So that's learning through watching somebody else being conditioned. We're learning through observing, through somebody modeling a behavior, and being able to discuss. And there's our Bobo doll on the right-hand side. That's Albert Bandura's research on TV models, aggression, and modern research on the effects of media violence. So that could also be quite a nice area they could ask you a question on, is Bandura and the violence, TV aggression and violence. So there's 3 areas of conditioning. Make sure you understand the terms clearly, you understand how that conditioning, classical conditioning process happens with your unconditioned stimulus and your unconditional response. Make sure you understand the terms. Operant conditioning is about positive and negative reinforcement. Make sure you understand Skinner, and observational learning, Bandura. So the question they asked in the last exam on this section was on observational learning, and the question is about, and again it applies a case study, so therefore you need to refer to the case study. And Sifiso in grade 2 didn't learn for his weekly spelling test. He's very tempted to look over at his partner's spellings. However, he remembers last week when his friend Jack was caught looking at someone else's work and was punished without a break. So Sifiso resists the temptation and tries to spell his own words. There's the case study, and it's talking about observational learning. In a short academic essay, discuss observational learning. Now, an academic essay, key word, important. Academic essay means an introduction. It means clear paragraphs, it means correct referencing, it means conclusion, and it means style and grammar. And it also means there'll be marks allocated for that. So don't lose marks by not doing an introduction and not doing a conclusion, not referencing, and having poor English and poor grammar. So on the bottom of that question, it says you'll be awarded 5 marks for your essay structure. Okay, so it's really important that when it says academic essay, you specifically make sure you apply those tools. So in a short essay, discuss observational learning. Ensure to explain the following concepts, making use of the examples from the above text to validate your response. So an explanation of observational learning is 5 marks of it. Discussing the dark side of observational learning with reference to Albert Bandura's experiment. That's about aggression and aggression in children and modeling adults. Discuss the imitation and the necessary cognitive process in the modeling of others' behaviors. The last one, culture and its impact, again, doesn't form part of our material for this year. So an essay like this, I think on previous essays, it's given you a page limit. It said no more than 1 page. I think 40 marks, again, is probably no more than about 1.5 pages. Don't overwrite. Remember, 5 of those marks are for the style. But if you get all of it, sort of 10 marks is 2 paragraphs, 5 marks is a paragraph, so it should take you just over to about 1.5 pages. So if we look at observational learning, just so you've got an idea, observational learning, and that's what it is. It first asks you to define it. It says to you what is it, and there's the process that it's a process of learning. When an organism's responding is influenced by observing others who are called models. Okay, and it's through watching. If you observe a colleague behaving confidently, professionally, and conscientiously in their work environment, and being praised for it, the chances are is that you would use that same behavior. And what are the cognitive processes required? And 10 marks was for the cognitive processes. In order to for observational learning to take place, you need to pay attention to another person's behavior. So Sifiso did. He paid attention to Jack's behavior of cheating. Retention. You need to have remembered that memory. So in the image, it says very clearly that Sifiso remembered that Jack had been punished for his behavior. Therefore, he was very clear that if he tried that behavior, the chances are he would be punished. That you can reproduce the behavior. Okay, so some people might see something that they can't do, but Sifiso could have very easily copied it. He knew how to write. He obviously saw how to do it, and so he was able to reproduce the behavior if he wanted to. And motivation, and you're unlikely to reproduce an observed response unless motivated to do so. Okay, so is the response going to pay off for you? In this case, Sifiso was motivated not to produce the response because he didn't want to be punished. So it's taking those cognitive processes of observational learning and applying them, most importantly, to the case study, because that's where it shows your application. So I think that is the content of our learning units, and I would suggest you go through those learning units and take each learning outcome and make sure that you know how to respond to those different outcomes. What I wanted to also just note is that there's a little slide here put together on writing an introduction and writing a conclusion. I think students do struggle with the introduction and conclusion. That idea for an introduction is often best to write it when you finish the main body of your essay, so you've got a good understanding of the topic. It should identify the subject of the essay and define key terms, highlight major issues which lie behind the question, and signpost the essay's argument. It's a very good first impression. It's called the halo effect in the mind of the lecturer grading your essay. If you start off well, you might be forgiven for making the odd mistake. So a nice, clear introduction that defines what you're going to talk about, maybe gives a description of a major theme, and just explain what's coming. And the conclusion, again, it says many students either forget, and I do see that students do forget to write the conclusion, or fail to give it the attention it deserves. Ideally, the conclusion should summarize the key themes or arguments of the essay, state the take-home message way up on the evidence presented. Okay, you're not going to really be talking about future, but you don't include any new information. You only include what has been in the body of your essay. If you're unsure of what to write, read the essay question and answer it in 1 paragraph. So just make sure you understand the difference between an introduction and a conclusion. They're not the same thing. They are different things, and that's just a little tip or help for you. And the final piece is, again, when it tasks you about to find academic journal articles. Reference. So an article refers to a piece of prose often included in publications such as newspapers or magazines. That's an article. A journal article is a scholarly publication consisting of academic study, achievements, and information regarding a discipline. So a journal article, that example we had in our last assignment on COVID and the healthcare, that is an academic journal article. Okay, it's specifically, you see the abstract, the introduction, the method, material, results, discussions, and conclusions. So when it says to you, find a journal article, look for a journal article. Don't look for a website article. Don't be scared of EBSCOhost. Don't be scared of finding proper journal articles. Please, and I say this every time, stay clear of Simply Psychology and things like that. I know that some of them are written by professionals, but we want to see that you can take research that's been done, understand what it is and the outcomes and that kind of thing, and apply it. And often it will state, and again, mistakes. Last time there was a question where it says, please do not use articles older than 10 years. So they can give you some very tight parameters to use. Make sure you read them. So if the article can't be older than 10 years, it can't be older than 2012. Okay, so make sure you just read the questions carefully. Guys, are there any questions? Because that's the end of the national support session. I would suggest, you know, it's give yourself time to write it, but give yourself time to do the research. I mean, I would give myself probably, but I would stand to be corrected, maybe 4 or 5 hours if you want to do it well. Remember that because this is a take-home exam, they're not going to expect you to regurgitate the textbook. They are going to ask you to do some research. It's going to take you a while to find the research that you want to use, and you might go through a few different research articles. Just don't take the first one. Take one that you understand and it's easy to work with. Don't make it more complicated for yourself than it should be. Okay. Yes, you do submit exams the same way. They go through SafeAssign as well. Yeah, so don't make life difficult for yourself and find questions that if you've done a question like in the ICE task on the brain, no, because you don't have to paraphrase your own ICE task. Your ICE task will already reference, and if we do get something like it's an ICE task, you're welcome to use what you've done, and you don't need to reference it back to yourself. It's fine. It's fine. Anything in an ICE task that you've done is your own work, whether it's you definitely have to use additional sources where we're asked to. If you show in your writing that if it hasn't asked you to and you do, it is a little bit like the halo effect, that it makes us feel that you really understand what you're talking about. So the questions that you do have to use, and your other questions where you don't remember, you're only citing the textbook, and it is good to have some additional sources in there, although they're not necessarily marked as additional sources. So yeah, put in additional sources where you have to, and where you don't have to, it's my suggestion. Otherwise, your whole document is just going to be Wheaton 2018, Wheaton 2018, Wheaton 2018. And so put in some additional sources. It shows us the effort that you've gone to, that you understand it, and it will probably make your answer better. It will make your answer more comprehensive. Courtney, when submitting, we can only send it to SafeAssign twice. Is that correct? I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not a SafeAssign expert. I don't know if Kath is still here, but I can find out for you and I can pop it up. I'm sorry, I'm not on the student side, so I don't know SafeAssign well enough. I don't know. Just to add to this, I did put a link on the groups. There is a collab, not by me, by somebody tomorrow on referencing. I think it could be Etta. And she is going to speak about APA alongside all the other referencing. So that's tomorrow. It's on twice. I think it's 12 and 7, if I'm not mistaken, or 1 and 7. And then on Wednesday, there's a collab on academic writing. It's the same link for both collabs. So if you want to attend both, you just use the same link, or if you want to pick and choose your sessions. But I would really suggest that if you're not very sure on certain things, it's a good idea to to be part of that. But I would also all suggest that you just rewatch that collab by Margaret if you haven't watched it, our librarian who did the collab for us, because obviously referencing is very key on this. But I did see a great, thanks Lou, I did see a great improvement in referencing in the last assignment, so well done to everybody. I think it is easier as you go, so hopefully it's not a major train smash for you. Guys, are there any more questions or anything? I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover, given you some ideas as to how questions could be asked and where they might be asked from, but I don't know. This last assignment took me by surprise with the scanning and the imaging questions, so I'm never too sure. But yeah, I mean, that was all pretty much textbook stuff with some additional research. So it's not difficult. And you've got plenty of time, plenty of time. So Kath and I are always available by email if you need us. And yeah, I will pop this recording up for everybody. I'll pop the slides up. It'll probably be first thing in the morning because it needs to download. And again, via email if you've got any questions. Okay. It's a pleasure, everybody. Keep warm, please. Okay, stop the recording.